All right, example number four here is, what fraction of cars are made in Japan? Well, we've constructed a 90% confidence interval below, which summarizes the result of a random sample of 50 automobiles, and there's your interval. What's the sample proportion? What's the margin of error? Now remember, ladies and gentlemen, that, and I'm going to draw this up here, that here's your lower confidence limit, your upper confidence limit, and what lies smack dab in the middle of that? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's your point estimate, your sample proportion. And then the distance of that sample proportion to the upper and lower confidence limits is your margin of error. So setting this up, it's not really too hard to find, but ladies and gentlemen, if you want to find p hat, the sample proportion, then it's just the average of your lower and upper limits. So go ahead and take your lower limit, add them together and divide by 2, and if you do that, you should get 0.3845. So that right there is p hat. That's the sample proportion. Okay? So approximately 38 to 39% was the percentage of cars that are made of Japan from the sample. That's just the sample proportion. Now B says find the margin of error. Well, again, the margin of error would be just this entire distance here divided by 2. It's the total length of your interval divided by 2. So to find your margin of error, you just take your upper limit minus your lower limit and divide it by 2. And so that would give you, and that's your margin of error. Okay? Now let's look at the last two parts here. And this goes about if you change something the interval. So let's say, for instance, if the researcher increased the sample size but kept the confidence interval at 90%, what would the interval be, wider or narrower? Now remember, if you increase the sample size, that means your sampling distribution has less variability. Less variability, ladies and gentlemen, means that your confidence interval is going to get narrower. So the question here is, if you increase the sample size, keeping everything else the same, you get a narrower interval. That's why what some people like to do is, if they don't want to mess with their confidence level, what they do is they get a larger sample, and that creates a narrower interval. Now, if the researcher increased the confidence level to 99% from 90%, but kept the sample the same size, what would happen to the margin of error? Now remember, the margin of error, if we go back, ladies and gentlemen, is basically these values right here. It's this distance and this distance. So if your interval gets narrower, your margin of error would be smaller. If your interval gets wider, your margin of error would be larger. So basically we're just saying what happens to the interval. So if the researcher increased the confidence level to 99% but kept the sample size the same, would the margin of error be larger or smaller? In other words, would your interval be larger or smaller? Well, remember, when you increase the level of confidence, you're actually increasing the value of your critical value. That is going up. Okay? If that gets bigger, then what happens is that makes your interval wider or larger. So if your interval gets larger, your margin of error is also going to get larger. So the correct answer to that is, if you increase the level of confidence, you're going to make your interval and thus your margin of error larger.